Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Good morning or good afternoon. Bon après-midi à tous. Je m'appelle Rami Hachtaib. Je suis le directeur régional de l'UE pour l'Afrique et le Moyen-Orient. Je suis ravi de vous voir parmi nous aujourd'hui et j'espère que vous vous portez bien ainsi que tous les membres de votre famille après cette période de confinement des 3 derniers mois. Aujourd'hui, nous allons avoir 2 présentations. Une première présentation de M. Rhys Kennedy sur la qualité de la récolte du maïs américain pour l'année 2019-2020 et une deuxième présentation du professeur Alvaro Garcia qui va nous présenter les bienfaits de l'incorporation des coproduits du maïs, DDGS, corn gluten feed et autres, dans la formulation de la nutrition animale. Ce séminaire durera à peu près une heure de temps. Je cède la parole à M. Mohamed Salah Bouchour pour la suite de l'animation de ce webinaire. Et je vous souhaite une bonne présentation. Merci.
Merci, Rami. Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour et bon après-midi. Je m'appelle Mohamed Salah Bouchour et je suis le marketing spécialiste de l'US Grain Council basé au bureau régional de Tunis, couvrant la région Europe, Moyen-Orient et Afrique. Je suis heureux de vous voir aujourd'hui parmi nous en bonne santé et heureux aussi de voir que les nouvelles technologies nous permettent d'être en contact régulier, et ce pour maintenir nos relations. Et vous assurer que les affaires aux États-Unis continuent de fonctionner régulièrement au niveau plantation, logistique et exportation. Comme annoncé par M. Rami, nous aurons 2 présentations aujourd'hui et après nous ouvrirons les débats pour 15 minutes. En attendant, bien sûr, n'hésitez pas à nous envoyer vos questions dans le box question and answer sur Zoom et de les envoyer. Rhys et Alvaro se feront un plaisir de vous répondre lors de ce webinaire ou ultérieurement par email. Maintenant, permettez-moi de vous présenter M. Rhys Kennedy, qui est le manager du Global Trade pour l'US Grain Council basé à Washington, D.C. À son poste, M. Rhys fournit l'US Grain Council de son expertise en matière de commerce international et trading et renforce les relations commerciales des États-Unis avec le reste du monde. Good morning, Rhys. I hope it's not too early for you to join us today.
Ce n'est pas de problème, Mohamed. Merci pour l'introduction.
Thank you.
Should I go ahead?
Just one thing. Pour les gens qui voudront entendre ce webinaire en français, il y a en bas un lien interpretation et vous pouvez switcher vers la langue française. Merci. Go ahead, Rhys.
Thanks, Mohamed. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rhys Kennedy, as Mohamed said, the manager of global trade at the U.S. Grains Council out of Washington, D.C. Talk to you today about the corn export cargo quality report that we published here just a month ago. Our harvest quality report is a report that we take that some of you may be familiar with, that comes out in the winter time. So it comes out in December, January. And that's when we take samples that are right here coming into the first point of sale, which would either be some sort of a country elevator or a sub-terminal elevator. And then when we look at our export cargo report, which is what we're talking about today, this is the grain being loaded onto a vessel. So that's when the grain is ready for export. This is where we've taken the samples this time. So when we look back at this chart of how U.S. grain moves, we would be taking the samples here rather than back here. So at this point, it's gone through a few truck shipments, perhaps some rail shipments, some barge shipments to get to the export elevator. Just quickly, we have 9 years of data, so please feel free to go to our website, which you'll see here at the end, to check out all of the 9 years prior that we have of data. Some of you may be familiar with this report. If you're not, I want to just show everyone that we divvy the data up into 3 export catchment areas. These export catchment areas are strictly due to how grain flows in the United States. So For North Africa, we really want to focus on this green area, and we want to focus on what's coming out of the Gulf, since that'll be our river system, and that's where all of the grain coming into your region runs. Looking at quality factors tested, we go through grading factors. So these are the factors that put a grade on your corn. So that's number 1 through 4 that people look at. And then we also looked at a mess of physical factors, which I won't get into today. We also checked the moisture, and then looking at chemical composition, which is protein, starch, and oil. And then lastly, we looked at a few mycotoxins. I have this slide. I won't go through it in great detail, but the slides will be released later, and you can review this at your leisure. So when we look at grade factors and moisture, this also I won't go through in detail, but this shows the U.S. grades number 1 through number 5. I don't think anybody is really buying number 5, but I know some number 4 gets sold. So this shows you your test weight, heat damage, total damage, and then BCFM. So just review this when you get the slides and be sure that you understand it when buying grain from the U.S. Looking at BCFM, this shows how we measure BCFM, which is broken corn and foreign material. FM would be any foreign material that would stay here on top of a sieve, being just a very small sieve. And then you'd have your broken corn falling through this first sieve, and then your fine material, which would be bunched in with the foreign material, is all of the particles that drop through a sieve half the size of the first one. When looking at BCFM this year, we did struggle a little bit with that at harvest compared to most years. However, coming out of the Gulf, you can see that people are buying number 2 corn, and number 2 corn is 3% BCFM. And we see out of the Gulf, people are able to hit that 3% BCFM mark. So I think number 2 corn is becoming harder to find in the market, but it's not impossible to find. And those that have bought number 2 corn have received it from the U.S. this year. It's important to note, we like to compare the data. So we look at data from our harvest report, which is here in blue, and data from our export report, and compare them every year. This was the highest BCFM we've seen in our export cargo report in the 9 years of taking it, but also was one of the highest we have seen at harvest. So it's important to note that the U.S. export system did a very nice job, I think, this year of mitigating BCFM, whereas in other years where the BCFM is 70% of what we saw this year at harvest, it got fairly close to what we saw this year at export. Looking at total damage, there was a lot of rain and a lot of wet weather in the Gulf region, in the Corn Belt area here. And so we did see a bit more damage come out of this region. However, that's still well within number 2 grade. So shouldn't be an issue there coming out of the Gulf for number 2 grade. And when we talk about damage, that doesn't include BCFM. That is damage to the germ of the grain. So a different measurement than BCFM. They're not coupled together. I know some countries do that. I'm not sure if Tunisia does. However, that's not the case in the U.S. When looking at moisture, the U.S., as you know, those of you that have bought from the U.S. exports at 14.5% moisture. They were able to hit that mark again this year. We look at moisture. This year at harvest, we had a very wet harvest. It was the wettest harvest we have ever seen. And you have to, no matter what, you always at export cargo have to get down to this 14.5%, which is how the grain is merchandised. So this year we had a larger necessity for drying, and that 3% decrease in moisture and the artificial drying that had to occur is the reason for some of that increased breakage that we saw before. Again, despite the increased breakage, you can still get number 2 grain from the U.S., but it's certainly larger up in the northern states in the Pacific Northwest region. Chemical composition, as we know, it's a combination of protein, starch, and oil. We look at protein. We had a slightly lower year on protein. Part of that is because of how wet it was. Generally the wetter the field is, just as sort of a rule of thumb, the less protein you're gonna find. And then when you have drier years, like here in 12, 13, where yields are lower, you'll find a little bit more protein in the grain. Starch, we saw a big drop off in starch after 2015-16 to 2016-17. But ever since then, we've been fairly consistent around the 72 to 73 mark. So this year coming in out of the Gulf at 72.5. So similar, very similar to what you might have seen the last couple of years. Mycotoxins. So for our mycotoxins, we took 431 samples for aflatoxin and 180 samples for DON or vomitoxin and fumonisin. This is the first year we were doing fumonisin in the tests. Those of you that follow the harvest report saw that as well. It's good to have added that, and we do plan to continue it in the future. This again is for your reference. I won't go into it too much, but I think it's important to note that dairy animals do have sensitivities to aflatoxin at 20 parts per billion. And then you have any kind of breeders in any kind of beef cattle or swine also can be a little bit more sensitive, whereas your feedlot cattle are the least sensitive when it comes to aflatoxin. However, we didn't really see any problems in aflatoxin testing. Aflatoxin comes out in drought years. This year was not an issue due to the intense moisture that we had during the growing season. We look at DON or vomitoxin levels. This is particularly tough on pigs or swine, which I don't believe should be much of an issue in Tunisia. And then you have a little bit of an issue in dairy cattle, just because that can transfer in through the milk, I believe. Alvaro would know more than that, would know more on that. And then also chickens can be a little bit susceptible to vomitoxin. However, at 5 parts per million being the level for swine, we didn't see any corn anywhere over 5 parts per million. So I do want to encourage that if you do get grain, be sure to test it and always know what you're feeding. But these are just good indications out of the U.S. regarding vomitoxin. Looking at historical results, we did see a little more this year. Vomitoxin generally is not a huge problem out of the U.S., but we did see a little more this year. But again, it came into this 0.5 to 1.9 range, which is really not a range of concern. But it is comparable, again, to the 16-17 year where we saw quite a bit of moisture. Fumonisin levels, this is something that was requested by a lot of people. You can see that breeding ruminants and breeding poultry can be a little bit susceptible at some smaller levels, whereas broilers are probably the least susceptible. Then you have some issues with rabbits and some smaller game, and then you have maybe some smaller ruminants and things like that be listed here at 10 parts per million. But again, we didn't see anything up to 10 parts per million. Everything came in below that. And if you look, the only thing that might be of concern would be equids and rabbits. Very sensitive to fumonisin, and we did see a little bit of grain come in that region for some sort of danger to equids and rabbits. But other than that, should be fine in the fumonisin category. But do, again, be sure that you're testing so that you can understand exactly what you're feeding and take care of your operation, your animals. This is the only year's worth of data that we have. When we look at our harvest report, we did see a bit more fumonisin. However, a lot of that is able to be fed in the United States. So it's a lot of fumonisin does flow to beef cattle feedlots in the United States, and a lot of it can flow to broiler houses as well. So I want to thank everybody. I know that was a little bit quick, but do please go to our website, which is www.grains. You can see the spelling right here. That's GRAINS.org. You can find the report in full there. You can dig into all of the data in detail. It's a really great resource. And again, we have 9 years of data. And we plan to do it again next year for our 10th year, and please be on the lookout for that as the U.S. harvest is around the corner. Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rhys, for your presentation. Merci, Rhys. Et maintenant, permettez-moi de vous présenter Monsieur Alvaro Garcia pour la seconde présentation. Alvaro Garcia est un docteur en médecine vétérinaire spécialisé en nutrition animale de l'Université de Minnesota. Il était professeur et président du département de nutrition au Collège de médecine vétérinaire de l'île Quay et professeur de sciences du lait et directeur de l'agriculture et des ressources naturelles à l'Université d'État du Dakota du Sud. Il a reçu plusieurs prix universitaires et publié plus que 500 articles et de livres sur des sujets en liaison avec la production animale. Il est actuellement consultant indépendant, entre autres pour l'US Grain Council. Alvaro, you can go ahead. Alvaro, can you unmute your...
Yes. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, c'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui avec vous. So, I'm having a little problem. I can't see my presentation now. Could you close yours, Rhys? Why can't I see my presentation? It was here. It was open, yeah. Oh, let me see this. I don't know what happened. It had closed, but can you see it now? Perfect. Can you hear me well? Good. Well, we are going to be talking about feeding distillers grains to cattle and livestock in general. This is a feed or a co-product that has been very, very dear to my heart, if you will, because basically I've started working doing research with them back in 2000 when we had this new wave of co-products coming into our livestock production practices. Here where the U.S. biorefinery locations are at, and I just chose to put that arrow because that's where I live. So I wanted you to see that I'm right in the midst of the main production area for distillers grains. Roughly, we have around 200, 220 plants oscillating depending on the time of the year and depending on the year, because as you know, this last year with all the coronavirus issues, we have some complications as far as the selling and shipping of products for the different parts of the U.S. The next slide, what I'm showing is the annual U.S. fuel ethanol production. And it's been interesting to note that, again, in 2019, we have a little drop in the ethanol production. And this is particularly because people started to move less and there was less consumption of gasoline. So that's what impacted the ethanol production in the U.S. In the next slide, what you are seeing is the monthly used grain, the type of grains that go for ethanol. And this is in 1,000 bushels. But what I wanted to show with this was that most of it is it's using corn grain, and then just some proportion of sorghum grain in some of the states, southern from where I'm at, like Kansas, parts of Nebraska, they use sorghum. But again, it's very, very little compared to corn. Most of the usage is by dry mills, which is where we obtain the distillers dry grains. And there's a percentage under 10% usually that's used by wet mills, where you get the sugar or fructose that's used in the beverage industry, like the colas, Coca-Colas, etc. For the different co-products, again, you look at the different tonnage as the year went by from 2019 to 2020. And again, you will see that in April 2020, the last row in that slide, we went decrease a little bit the distillers grains production, approximately 1 million tons. And again, it's not only distillers grains, but other industries suffered as well. From this industry, we produce CO2 that goes to the carbonated beverage industry. And also fat that is extracted to be used in biodiesel production and to be used in animal feed as well. So as you see, main products still continue to be dry distillers grains, and the wet distillers grains is used when it's in close proximity to the plant, so it's not of any importance to you right now. But across the year, what has happened is that the plants have started to look for new sources of income. And what they've done is they have started to extract the oil from distillers grains. Again, if you look at this slide, what it's showing is that the gross values of the crop products is 20 to 25% right now, basically. But it was very little years ago, back in the early 21st century, 2000, 2001, and that's represented by the blue bar there. It shows that there was very little use, and that's where we started to explore, to research the distillers grains and see how we could improve. And we did such a successful job that basically we obtained it free at the start for our research. We had to pay it back in the 2011, 2012, and 13, etc. We started to pay for the product to conduct our research. But again, what I'm trying to show with this slide is that the oil represents a significant fraction of the income for the plants at roughly 16%, and the crop products 20-25%. So most of the plants will not be able to make it if they don't use the crop products as an added source of revenue. What this slide is showing is that basically there are different steps in the production of the distillers grains, and some of them are more critical than others. If you look, we have very good quality grain, and I'm saying that the grain that comes into the ethanol plant or biorefinery, it has to be of very good quality. Why? Because if it was of lesser quality, or if we had, for example, mycotoxins or molds, they would interfere with the fermentation, and that's something that the plants does not want to happen. So it goes into the plant, then it's milled and it's cooked, it's liquefied, adding water to it, and then they add an enzyme, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, in that step of fermentation. And in that step is where the CO2 is separated, which will be used for bottling, dry ice uses, and others. Precisely because of these conditions that we had a shortage, there was a shortage also, a shortage of ethanol production. There was a little shortage also of carbon dioxide for the use in the beverage industry. From there, we go to the distillation, and in the distillation, of course, you separate the ethanol, and that ethanol goes to the market, basically, for the gasoline industry, where it's added usually is at a 10%, although there are some areas that are exploring higher percentages as 15%, for example. But then from the distillation, you usually go to a couple of centrifugations, and that is to separate the oil. And the oil could be used for the animal feed industry. It's very coveted, very looked after, to be used in poultry, for example, to be used in swine, or it will be used for biodiesel production. The dry distillers grains, they use usually a drum dryer, and they will be produced to be shipped out of the country as a feed for ruminants, swine, and poultry. But the thing is, it's not only shipped out of the country. Right now in the US, we're kind of topped out at the amount that we can use. It is such a good buy that the feed mills really incorporate in almost any feed that they have available for the producer. What happens is that if they wouldn't incorporate distillers grains, they would not be competitive in price and quality with other feeds because of precisely the high concentration of nutrients and the competitive price. So the critical points in this slide are two that are surrounded there by the red circle, and it's the centrifugation. It's what's going to determine how much oil is extracted from the distillers grains, and the drying is the other, the top circle, that's showing what it used to be a problem where we haven't yet perfected the drying technology, and we have some problems with damaging the product with excessive temperature. Today, these problems have been solved. The thing is that by adding the centrifuges, we have removed the oil, and of course, this is a very interesting thing, because from one perspective, it removes some of the energy of the distillers grains, but from another perspective, removing part of the oil doesn't interfere as much in the digestibility of the rest of the feedstuffs that form part of that ration. So here we have a sample of the distillers grain, and I chose to include this one because we don't have a lot of analysis around that shows the levels of amino acids and different characteristics of the distillers grains. So if you look at this slide, if you are going to be importing distillers grains, the distillers grains is imported on a basis usually of pro-fat, which is the protein plus the fat content, and you see that on the left block there, where it says pro-fat 36 basis 34 minimum, and it's in essence 36 means if you know how much fat is in the product, 6% in this case, then it will have roughly 30% protein in the product. But again, the protein can range between 26 and 30%. Why is this range? Because when we are breeding now, when we have varieties, corn varieties with higher starch concentration, the higher the starch concentration, the lower the protein will be. So basically, when we extract the starch to ferment it to ethanol, what happens is that our percentage crude protein drops. Basically, if we had a 7% protein in the corn, in the initial corn, and we extract the starch, then the distillers grains will multiply that, in the distillers grains, that concentration will be multiplied by 3. Usually the values that we are seeing are around 8-9% protein, so the ending distillers grains will have 24 to 28% crude protein. Again, other important aspects to look at here, if you see at the middle column, there's a Hunter L value right there that says 51.1. The Hunter L, what it's measuring is the color of the distillers grains, and we are always looking for distillers grains that's high yellow to color, particularly on the yellow side, and this is when the Hunter L value is above 50 points. So we want to look at distillers grains with 50 and above. That's very important. Again, remember that distillers grains is a product arising from corn, so any deficiency of amino acids like lysine, tryptophan, for example, that are deficient in corn, on a percentage basis will also be deficient in distillers grains. So what are the concerns more that importers have with distillers grains? There are basically 6. One is the caking or the agglomeration of distillers grains. The second one is the presence of antibiotics or their lack thereof. The third, as Reese was mentioning, is the mycotoxins. The fourth is the variability. Number 5 is the minerals. And finally, the concentration of fat and fatty acids. Let's take a look at each of these points and see how worrisome they can be. So the caking basically happens because of the particular characteristic of the distillers grains, which are a product usually with a higher than normal fat content, even in the distillers grains that has been reduced in fat, we still have double almost or 50% more than the fat in corn. But one of the main concerns is the density and the particle size. The particle size, as you see in the slide, ranges from 612 to 2,125 microns. And because of this small particle size, and because of the moment it's loaded, it could still be warm from the plant, it could tend to agglomerate. So this is a concern, particularly when you store distillers grains. That's why we always ask and we suggest that never store distillers grains in grain silos or in grain bins, but store them on the floor in a covered structure like the ones you see in the picture there. This will avoid any kind of problems with the caking in distillers grains. The second concern for the importer is oftentimes the antibiotics that have been used in the process. So the thing is that we use antibiotics in the distillers grains production because we want to control any other bacteria that we don't want interfering with the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the one we add to produce the alcohol. So basically there are two antibiotics that have been used. One is the virginiamycin, and up to 2 parts per million. Not a problem because it's destroyed during the drying process, and we cannot find any remnants or any virginiamycin left in the product. Same with the penicillin that's being used. Again, this antibiotic is inactivated by ethanol, and it's degraded at a low pH. And one thing we have to remember that because this is a fermentation process, the pH of the distillers grains that comes out of the plant is very low, around 4 or even under 4. So it's almost like silage, if you will, from the point of view of the pH, which is very helpful because it doesn't allow the proliferation of undesirable molds and bacteria. Let's look at the other concerns, which are the mycotoxins. We have 3 genera of molds that we are concerned about: the Aspergillum, the Fusarium, and the Penicillium. So of these 3, the Aspergillus, we have several mycotoxins being produced, but the one that it's more relevant to us is the aflatoxin B1. As Reese was pointing out very well, this season we haven't seen any problems, and in the history of the samples that have been obtained from the distillers grains through US grains, we haven't seen levels that are of concern for the producer. Then the Fusarium type of molds, where the fumonisine B1 and zearalenone are of concern. But again, as Reese pointed out, the deoxynivalenol or DON and trichoticins, those are 2 that need to be taken into consideration. Not in poultry as much as it would be, for example, in ruminants, depending on their age and depending on the amount that they're being fed of the grain. And thirdly, the penicillium. Penicillium is usually not that big of a problem, except for the ochratoxin A that's produced by the Penicillium verrucosum. But again, the penicillium you can see in a lot of feeds. If you leave some fruit in the refrigerator, you will see some growth of mold after a few days on the surface, and that's part of the penicillium, is that greenish, green color mold, which is not really toxic. Actually, we add some penicillium to the Roquefort cheese, and that's a very good thing that most of us like to eat. A few years ago, we made an evaluation of what happened with the distillers grains, both dry and wet, as far as the molds and mycotoxins. And we looked at several samples that were submitted to a laboratory in New York. And of all the mycotoxins that we looked at, we had aflatoxin, vomitoxin, zearalenone, trichoticins or T2, ochratoxin, and fumonisin. So basically, all the samples were under the levels of action specified by the FDA, as Reese was pointing out. The only one that we saw that was relatively close was vomitoxin at 362, and that this is consistent with the concern in the U.S. that vomitoxin or DON is the one that can reach levels that are a little close to the action level, which is 5 ppm. Look at the average in that work that we did was 362, so it's well below the average. Again, aflatoxins at 461, when the limit is 20 parts per billion, it's really very low and not of concern. Same for the other mycotoxins that are in this example. The other thing is the variability. Through the years, the distillers grains early, I would say in the 20th century, we were concerned about the variability in the distillers grains. This was represented by variability in the dry matter content, variability in the protein content, look at 28.7 to 32.9, variability in the fat content. Now, this is being not an issue practically because most of the plants are defattening or reducing the oil. But then we also have variability in fiber, in ash, lysine, and phosphorus. Now, as the process have been standardized, and there have been companies that are leading the country, the US, in doing research and producing quality distillers grains that they have actually registered with a name brand to differentiate, it has led to a product that is not anymore a general product or a generic product, if we want to say, but a product that is registered for quality. And such example is products that are well known for their high digestibility, their very, very yellow color, and one of them, without making references, Dakota Gold is well known for their quality. Again, one of the problems, as I showed in the slide that was showing all the process, has been the heat damage protein, and this was when we were not really aware of the problems that it could be created when we heat the distillers grains in excess. What happens is when we have a very, very high temperature and during a certain period of time, so it's a function not only of temperature, but temperature and time, what happens is that there's a reaction known as the Maillard reaction that happens between protein and sugars, and particularly the lysine in the protein is bound and becomes undigestible to the animal. So you can imagine that if a product like corn and corn distillers grains distillers grains that derive from corn, if lysine was already limiting, if it's heated and it's bound to sugars through the Maillard reaction, then we end up with a product where lysine is very deficient. And this is particularly true when we include higher concentrations of distillers grains in the diet, for example, 20% and above. Right there, we saw that the first limiting amino acid was lysine, regardless if the product of the distillers grain was heat damaged or not. So one of the good indicators of this damage is an analysis that we perform, which is the acid detergent in soluble nitrogen. It's basically, we run an ADF fiber analysis, and we test for the nitrogen present in that acid detergent fiber. All the nitrogen that will be in that fraction will be considered and available, and the result of heat damage during the process. So here we have a color variation of distillers grains, and it ranges, of course, from high ADIN, when we see really dark brown, almost in some instances I've seen almost colors close to black, to low ADINs. And the interesting thing of this is that the color is not strictly associated with lower digestibility or less available protein. But it's a very good indicator. If you're going to be buying distillers grains, you need to look at the distillers grains that are more towards the right of this picture, but there's more of a yellow, golden coloration compared to the one to the left, which is a very dark coloration. Again, the color is not necessarily meaning that there is heat damage, because if you add more solubles to the product, it will be a little bit darker. So basically, you have to test. If you have doubts, you have to test for ADIN to make sure that it's not heat damage. Then the minerals, interesting, the sulfur with a range from 0.31 to 1.93. Again, one of the reasons is because sulfuric acid is used in the process, and just for cleaning the surfaces inside the equipment, and also from the point of view of trying to halt any other bacteria that could have been developed inside the equipment. The problem with high sulfur is the possibility of creating polioencephalomalacia, particularly in young animals. I haven't seen that happening in older cattle, but in young calves and in areas where we also have high sulfur water, it could become a problem. The sodium, it's relatively high, 0.01 to 0.53. So we have to be careful, particularly with poultry, because it leads to higher water intake. And if you're raising chickens in bedding, it will result in wet bedding. And again, the phosphorus, it's very interesting because we usually have to supplement with phosphorus, and it can be up to 1%. Values very close to what we have in wheat bran, and very important in parts of the world where phosphorus is a problem for cattle. So for us, it can become a problem because we usually supplement a lot of phosphorus in our diet. So if we also add a lot of distillers grains, which most producers are doing, it could result in higher levels of phosphorus than required. And finally, the fat and fatty acids. The new generation distillers grains, the ones that would be arriving in Tunisia and in other regions in the area, would be distillers grains that has reduced fat, roughly around 6% fat. Now, with this fat, what is important is the type of fatty acids that are in it, and it's the linoleic acid, the one that has 2 double bonds. So that one is the one that really causes milk fat depression. And so one of the things we have to do is when we are testing for distillers grains, we have to consider the type of unsaturated fatty acids separately. Oleic, linolenic will not give that much of a problem, but the linoleic, the one with 2 double bonds, will cause milk fat depression. Here have the U.S. distillers grains production by type and utilization by species. As you can see, the distillers grains production by type, most of it in the U.S. is dried, because obviously there's a big market for dried within the U.S. and for export. The wet around 27%, and the modified wet 13%. The modified wet is a wet that we remove more moisture out of it. The wet has roughly around 65% moisture. The modified wet has only 50% moisture. And then the other pie chart shows the distillers grains consumption by species. Most of it by beef cattle, then dairy cattle, then poultry, then swine, and then other species like companion animal feeding or like feed for fish production, aquaculture. It's becoming very popular in aquaculture feeds, and in dairy cattle, I would say it's almost a must for dairy producers because of the high concentration of nutrients and because of the very competitive pricing because of this concentration of nutrients. In beef cattle, it's almost always used just as an equivalent to corn, and it's substituted in the diets, even up to 40% of the diet. So you can imagine that because of the lower protein requirements in the beef diets, including such high levels of distilled grains in those diets will result in excess protein in the diet of beef cattle. But if the price is right, producers don't really mind feeding excess protein in their diets. A few years ago, we did a little bit of a calculation with a student of mine, and we looked at a formula to estimate what was the energy content in the distilled grains when we removed the fat from it. And this is a formula, and basically we came to the conclusion that when we had distilled grains with 6% fat, the energy value was 91% of the full fat distilled grains. Now, this is very nice on paper, and I'm criticizing probably myself, but it's very nice on paper, but it doesn't really happen in real life very often. Why? Because the animals actually compensate with greater intake. Whenever there is less energy in the diet, the animal will eat more. And you know, those are in poultry, you know that when you have higher fiber in the diet of chickens or broilers, the conversion is poorer, the feed conversion is poorer, because the animals will be eating more to compensate for that energy deficit. The same happens with the cows. I mean, the cows will eat a little bit more because there is a little less energy in the diet. So it's very difficult to witness a change in body weight gains or a change in production because there is this compensation that sometimes we cannot detect in the research trials. So let's look at poultry and some of the use of reduced fat distilled grains. In poultry, you had here 5 samples with different oil percentages. You see it ranges from 10.7 to 2.3. Again, this 2.3, 3.9, and 4, those are almost, I would say, experimental at this point. There are no products in the market that have so little fat in their constitution. The problem is that to get 4.39 or 2.3 in oil means that you have to use solvents for extraction, and that's costly, and the plants are not using. They are basing mostly in centrifugation. So the most likely product that you will be getting now in Tunisia and the surrounding regions will be one that has 6.5% oil. Eventually, you might get one with 10%, but that's very rare. So I would say that the metabolizable energy in kilocalories per kilogram would be roughly around 2,600 kilocalories per kilogram for a 6.5% oil distilled grain. So there was this research done in laying hens using reduced fat distilled grains. And there were they used 3 distilled grains. One would call the full fat distilled grains in the first column that has 28.9% protein and 11.2% fat. The one that has medium oil concentration, that it's probably close to one that you could receive here with 28.3% protein and 7.3% fat. And then the low oil distilled grains with 27.5 protein and 5.6 fat. Let's take a look at what happened. What was the response of the chickens? If we look at the layers, the intake and egg production, it happens exactly what we would suspect that would happen. Look at the column of feed intake, which is the very light blue there. The feed intake increases when you are the medium fat and the low fat distilled grains, okay? And the egg production basically has very little difference. Those are probably non-significant, but again, a little lower when you have the very low fat distilled grains compared to the control. Let's remember that the distilled grains is important not only because they supply energy, but at the same time, those fatty acids like the linoleic acid are very important for the size of the egg and for stimulating the reproduction in animals. So again, if we look at what happened in this same trial, this is the same trial, reduced fat distilled grains, what are the treatment effects? They didn't see much difference. I mean, if you look at the hen body weight, the column to the left, between the control, the full fat distilled grains, the medium fat distilled grains, reduced fat distilled grains, very little difference. These are not significant numbers. So they could have happened just by chance. They're not statistically significant. The egg weight, kind of similar, almost 59 for the control, 59 for full fat, 59.9 for the medium fat, 59.7 for the reduced fat, and the feed conversion, 176, 177, 176, 175. So there was not a big difference between the different types of distilled grains with high fat and with low fat. So this again reinforces what I was saying earlier on, that the animal is compensating with intake, so there's not much of a difference. In spite of this, the feed conversion, or grams of feed per grams of egg, was not that much affected in this trial. So reduced fat distilled grains in poultry, the thing is that if you have reduced fat, you may want to supplement with oil, for example, when you're growing broilers or poultry for meat, basically. If it's very well balanced, there's no difference in performance. We can balance rations very well using distilled grains. And the corn oil that's present in the distilled grains has linoleic acid that has potential added effects. What are those effects? One is the egg size. With more linoleic acid, the egg size increases. And even with the reduced fat distilled grains, remember that we are talking about 6% fat. That means that we have 50% more fat than with corn grain. So that could have a very significant effect on the egg size. The young bird growth, the linoleic acid is essential for the growth of the young chicks. And the pigmentation, when we said that in distilled grains, the products were concentrated 3 times, the pigments, such as carotenoids and xanthophylls, are also concentrated by 3 times. So, in short, the suggested feeding levels by several universities, here I chose Minnesota, Georgia, and Michigan State, for starter chicks, basically 5% of the diet. And this is particularly because of the balance of amino acids. If you include more than 5% in the diet, you'll have to include more protected amino acids like more lysine, more tryptophan. Chicken and turkeys, grow, finish, and broilers, around 10% in the diet. And layers, laying hens, 15% in the diet. They're the ones that can be included more. Having said this, I will say that there are experiments using more distilled grains, even up to 20%, and they have worked very well. What we have to remember to make this work is that the corn distilled grains comes from corn. So basically, any of the deficiencies that we have in corn, we will have in corn distillers, mainly lysine and tryptophan from this perspective. So let's talk a little bit about the ruminants and how can we feed the distilled grains in ruminants to make it an effective choice. In ruminants, basically the production or the successful production is based on the genetics of the animals, the management, and the feeds and the feeding. So we have to choose the right concentrate when we are going to formulate the diets for ruminant. And that concentrate, the properties of that concentrate are that it has a high nutrient concentration, that it optimizes the amount and site of the nutrient digestion. And when I'm saying the amount and site, I mean where in the digestive tract is happening. Is it happening in the pre-stomachs, or is it happening lower in the digestive tract? It has limited nutrient variability, so we know approximately how many nutrients or the concentration of those nutrients in the product. And this one is key. It does not interfere with forage digestibility. Because we know that if we use products that have high starch concentration, let's say, for example, corn grain or wheat for that matter, or other cereal grains, their high starch concentration can interfere with the digestibility of the forage fraction in the diet of the ruminant. So the top 4 byproducts that are used in the US right now are, number 1 is distilled dry grains. There's no one, and I'm going to say this very confidently, there's no one that is knowingly or unknowingly using distilled grains. Why do I say this? Because there are producers that say, well, I'm not using distilled grains, but they're buying the ration from the feed mill, and nearly every feed mill has distilled grains in there as a component of the feeds because of the convenience of price and because of the convenience of the addition of nutrients that are highly coveted, for example, protein, phosphorus, energy, etc. The second one is the corn gluten feed from the wet milling industry. And I know this one is also getting into Tunisia and the region. I really love corn gluten feed, a very good product, particularly for dairy cows. Dairy cows love it. Wheat middlings, probably you also get it often. And the hominy meal. The hominy meal is a very good product, also derived from the wet milling. And it's a very interesting product that has high levels of digestible fiber, high levels of fat, and also acceptable levels of protein. So here's the nutrient content of the distilled grains. Protein is a source of bypass protein. Nearly 40 to 67% of the protein is bypass. And of this bypass, the intestinal digestibility of the amino acids is over 92%. This is very good, considering that only soybean meal has these high values of intestinal digestibility. The fiber, approximately 30 to 40% of the dry matter, and the new generation distilled grains have less fiber, less NDF, than the National Research Council suggests as their concentration. This is important. Why? Because fiber, as we know, will reduce the energy value of the product, particularly for monogastric animals, such as the swine, the chicks, etc. And in dairy, it's not that important because this fiber of the corn distilled grains is very digestible. It's the corn cuticle basically, and it's very digestible, easily digestible by the ruminant. The fat in the past distilled grains had 10% fat. That's what the one I used to work back in the early 2000s. But the modern plants leave 4 to 6% fat and more leanings towards the 6%. We haven't yet perfected the technology to bring it down economically to 4%. And it's very rich in unsaturated fatty acids, mainly the linoleic, as I was stating previously. This is important because the linoleic could cause problems of a reduction in the milk fat in dairy cows. So from one perspective, we were not happy when they removed fat from the distilled grains because of the energy content. But on the other hand, this allowed us to include more distilled grains because there was less linoleic and we had less problem with reduced milk fat. So the advantages of the distilled grains in the ruminant are, first of all, the no starch. They don't contain starch. So oftentimes I've been saying that what distilled grains has is almost as important as what the distilled grain does not have. So I'm very happy with distilled grains not containing starch, containing more oil, and containing more protein and digestive fiber than maize or corn. Why I'm saying this? Because usually one of the constraints when we feed high-producing cows is that we add too much starch in the diet. And that leads to problems of subclinical acidosis or clinical acidosis in the dairy cow. So what we want, obviously, is to feed the animals with a product that will not cause me these problems. And because the distilled grains has no starch or very little starch, whatever starch is left is completely undegradable by the animal, then it doesn't create me those problems. So digestible fiber plus no starch means that more acetate than lactate is being produced in the rumen. What this leads to, when we have more acetate, more butter fat precursors are available, and thus we will have more milk fat. Now, some people have said, hey, but when we include the steers, we have seen lower milk fat. And it has happened. But it has happened because when you balance the ration, if you don't consider that the particle size of the distilled grains is very small, then you run into a shortage of effective fiber. The problem is not that you're adding a lot of fat from distilled grains. The problem is that your particle size in the overall diet is not adequate. So the decrease in the propionate production, because there is very little starch in the diet, leads to an increase in the intake. Why? Because the latest theory of feed intake in ruminants is the hepatic oxidation theory, and is the propionate transformed into lactate that goes to the liver that will inhibit the feeding of the animal. So, because of the hepatic oxidation theory, when we have less propionate, less lactate, then we have less acidic pH, less problems with acidosis, and at the same time, greater feed intake by the animal. So we have more fiber while we maintain the gains of the animal. The less acidic pH does not inhibit the fiber digestion. This is incredibly important because if you're not inhibiting the forage digestion, you are allowing the cow to utilize the maximum value out of that forage. So if I'm feeding, for example, a lot of corn or any other grain, I'm relatively inhibiting some of the forage digestion because of interaction in the rumen microbial population. Now, if I feed distilled grains because it has no starch, there is no inhibition of those microbes that will be digesting the fiber. And that's what I want. From a producer perspective, I want to utilize the maximum of the fiber because that's the way to produce in a less expensive way. And we can add urea to balance the soluble crude protein, because when we add a lot of distilled grains, and by a lot I mean maybe 20, 30% of the diet, we can still need some easily digestible protein or rumen degradable protein, and then we can balance that excess with urea. So let's talk about how much do we feed? What are the ideas? Feeding distilled grain to cattle, let's talk about calves, growing heifers, lactating cows, and fattening cattle. So when we are feeding distilled grains to calves, we did an interesting trial. I think it was kind of unique a few years ago, where we used some Holstein calves, and we had a controlled diet, a diet with 28% distilled grains 1, and a diet with 56% distilled grains. So we doubled the amount. We went from 0 to 28 to double it to 56. We fed milk replacers up to 6 weeks of age, and we fed these diets up to the 12th week of age of the calves. Here's the composition of the 3 diets. We balanced the diets to 22% crude protein. Here are the ADF concentrations, very similar. The NDF varied because, of course, as we were including distilled grains, as it has higher NDF, the NDF increased from 15.4 to 20.3 to 25.3. The same happened with the ether extra, or the fat. It increased from 2.9 to 5.1 to 7.3. But if you look down into the columns, you will see that we maintain the energy constant. Net energy maintenance at 2.1, net energy gain at 1.6. So the comparisons were valid because the energy was supplied in a different way, but it was constant for the animals. And then of course we balance the amino acids and the minerals. So here's what we saw in the animals, the intake per week. If you look at the control, which are the red diamonds, no difference with distillers grains 1. Distillers grains 2, they apparently ate a little bit more, but there was a difference in weeks from week 9 on, week 9, 10, 11, and 12. They ate a little bit more when they were fed 56% distillers grains. Remember, control is 0 distillers grains. Distillers grains 1 is 28%. Distillers grain 2 is 56%. If we look at the weight gains per week, we saw no difference. They all gained the same, whether the control, the 28%, the 56%, they all gained the same weight. If we look at the hip height, there were no statistical differences, although you see that the columns are different in height. This was not different statistically. So the hip height was not different between the control, the distillers grade 1 and the distillers grade 2. For the wither height, it was different between the distillers grade 1 and the distillers grade 2. Distillers grade 2 were taller at the withers, basically, but there was no difference with the control with the distillers grade 1 or the distillers grade 2. Here's the interesting aspect. I think this explains a lot of things of why we are seeing better performance with different concentration of distillers grains. We looked at the rumen papillae. We slaughtered some of the calves. We empty the rumen content, and we look at the papillae. What is really interesting is what is enclosed in that red circle, is that the density or the number of papillae that were per square centimeter was 75 for the control. It went up to 117 with distillers grains at 28%, and then it went down again with distillers grains at 56%. Remember that the papillae are essential for the absorption of the volatile fatty acids. So when we increase from 0 to 56%, so we saw a decrease in 56%, but when we were at 28%, we saw the maximum papillae number. And here's a picture of those papillae. Look at the control, is the one on the left. Look at distillers grain 1 at 28, at distillers grain 2 at 56. What you see is very clearly that with distillers grain 2, there's not a lot of papillae compared to distillers grain 1. There's more per area of surface. So the 28% concentration was better than the 56% concentration. And this is something very important because recently, this was posterior to our experiment, it has been demonstrated that the high NDF2 starch negatively affects the expression of the gene that regulates the growth of rumen papillae. And that's what can be happening in this 56% concentration distillers grains. It's too much. It's too much, and it's inhibiting the growth of the rumen papillae, whereas with the 28%, it's really maximized. So in conclusion, we found that similar daily gains for all three treatments. The calves on distillers grain 2 were taller, consumed more ration, but as a result were less efficient. So we came to the conclusion that do not exceed 28% distillers grains in the ration of the distillers grains, of the growing calves. So we feed distillers grains, straw, maize stalks in growing heifers. This really revolutionized the industry because what happened is that producers were used to feed alfalfa, and when we told them that they could feed maize stalks with distillers grains and have similar performance, they were ecstatic. They really loved the idea. Commercial diets, basically mixing the wheat, the straw with any kind of straw. We've been using wheat, we've been using rye, we've been using corn stalks, and we mix them with distillers grains. We add water if it's too dry, and it had been doing very good. These are some growing heifers that were on a trial. They had 32% distillers grains in the diet, so this is higher than the 28 I was suggesting for the younger animals, but these are older animals, so 32% distillers grains, hosting heifers, pregnant and virgins in the same group. Again, this is the description of what's happening with the NRC balancer. What you can see there is that the energy allowable for gain was 1.83 pounds per day. This is roughly 900 grams per heifer per day. And the metabolizable protein allowable was for 2.25 pounds per day. So they had enough protein to grow if they wanted by 1 kilo roughly per day. Again, if you look at the balance, a nutritionist will tell you, well, this is not possible. Look at rumen degradable protein is minus 143 grams, and the metabolizable protein balance is only 78 grams positive. But hey, they did very well, and if you're concerned, you could add some urea to the mix, and that will solve your rumen degradable protein balance. So in conclusions, the distillers grains can be fed up to 30% of the diet. More fiber, you can add more fiber to dilute the energy or restrict the intake of the heifers, and you can substitute the corn pre-puberty with pre-puberty without affecting milk production or components post-calving. And the distillers grains all pre-puberty can reduce the services per conception. Very, very interesting in growing heifers. Lactating dairy cows, real quick, we're going through them. Reduced fat distillers grains have higher crude protein, higher rumen and degradable protein. We usually pay more for this, and we have it for free, if you will, in the distillers grains, with values that go from 50 to 60%, and lower fiber compared to the distillers dry grains of the past. The reduced fat distillers grains, substituting soybean meal in the diet, at 10, 20, and 30% of the diet, similar intake and milk production. So it can substitute very nicely the soybean meal that is usually very expensive in every part of the world. At 10 and 20%, highest milk protein, and at 30%, the highest milk fat of all. This really is different than some of the early research that they say that at 30% distillers grains, you would add milk fat to present. No, if you balance it right and your particle size is right, you can have highest milk fat. Again, this is just an example of a diet, a balance for 45 liters with forage concentrate 50-50 using maize, silage, lucerne hay, or alfalfa hay, mature grass hay. And we always use a balance between lysine and methionine of 3, 6.6, and 2.2% of the metabolizable protein, and a maximum total fat of 6.5 in the diet. These are the diets without distillers grains and with 20% reduced fat distillers grains, the usual component, except that in one we are including reduced fat or low fat distillers grains at almost 12 pounds per day per cow. And in the other one, we are not including. What I wanted to show you is that without the distillers grains, your linoleic acid was 526 grams per day versus 391 with the 20% reduced fat. The level usually of concern is the 400 and above. So 20% reduced fat distillers diets can be formulated adequately. Basically, with the rumen and degradable protein that we are supplying with distillers grains, you can linearly increase milk and milk protein in diets high in rumen degradable protein. So we are adding rumen undegradable protein by using the distillers grains, and it has been confirmed with the rumen undegradable protein derived from the distillers grains. Again, milk and milk protein were greater when the distillers grains replaced this rumen undegradable protein of the soybean meal. And just to finish, we're talking about distillers grains in fattening cattle. This experiment with Holstein steers using high moisture corn, maize silage, and soybean meal. 70% high moisture corn, 15% maize silage, and 15% soybean meal. Initial weight of the animals, 136 kilograms. Final weight, 590 kilograms at 300 days, and 5 treatments. One was the control, with the balanced up to 14% crude protein with soybean meal. And then we have the distillers grains at 12.5%, and the addition of urea to take it again to 14% crude protein. The distillers grains at 25% of the diet. The distillers grains at 37.5% of the diet, and then drop to 20% once the animals reach 365 kilograms, and the distillers grains at 50% of the diet all the time. Here's with the feed intake. If we look at the feed intake of the animals, it increased steadily when we went up to 25% of the diet. When we went to the 37% of the diet and then dropped it to 20%, there was no difference. So the intake was still the same, but the intake was lower when it was at 50%. Just remember what we said, 50% distillers grains in the diet probably damages the papilla in the rumen, and the animals will not be utilizing the feed as efficiently. The weight gains, the best weight gains again were obtained at 12.5 and at 37% distillers grains, and then drop to 20%. So it will depend on what price you get the distillers grains, the convenience or not of including it at those levels in the diet. Feed efficiency, the highest feed efficiency was obtained when you feed the distillers grains between 20 and 37% of the diet. So the feed to gain ratio here is when you get the most money for your investment in feed. So based on these results, the inclusion depends on corn and distillers grain prices. This is logical. If the distillers grains is priced at above 110% of the price of corn, use 12 and 25% inclusion, which is low inclusion. If it's the same price as corn, go for the 25-30% inclusion. And if the distillers grains is less than 90% of the corn, use it as corn. Just drop the other concentrates and use distillers grains as if it was corn. So in conclusions, they had similar weight gains, intake and feed efficiency, similar carcass weight, yield and quality, increased marbling and reduced abscesses, and it can replace steam flake corn without affecting gain and carcass yield or quality. And this is all I had to present. I don't know if I went a little over time, but to me, it's very fun and enthusiastic to talk about distillers grains because it's such a wonderful feed that I want to share what I do know about it.
Thank you, Alvaro, for this presentation. It was a great one. Maintenant, si vous avez des questions pour Rhys et Alvaro, vous pouvez écrire dans la partie chat ou questions et réponses. Hier, on a reçu 2 questions pendant l'enregistrement. La première qui dit c'est quoi l'impact de la qualité et l'origine de la matière première telle que le maïs sur la qualité physique de l'aliment granulé, dureté et durabilité. La deuxième, quels sont les coproduits qui ont une valeur nutritive importante et qui seront la tendance pour les prochaines années. So Alvaro, yesterday we received 2 questions.
Yes.
The first, it's which the impact of the quality and the origin of the raw material, like corn, on the physical quality of the compound feed. We are talking about hardness and durability. This is the first question. The second one, which coproduct whom have a high nutritional value and which are the trend for the next years?
Okay. So I'm going to address real quick the first one. Right now we are conducting a trial with U.S. grains, and Reese is going to be in the call later on. What we are trying to do is to value the U.S. corn and compare it to corns from different origins. What I do think is that from years to today, what we have done is always sell corn grain per ton, on a per ton basis, right? And that's what we pay it for. But we never really looked at the composition of the corn. And I think that the quality, it is a great question, because I think that in the future, we need to place more importance in the quality of the corn. The corn in the United States has been selected for years for high starch. And this is what we want in corn. What we want in corn is a product that provides high energy that comes from the starch. Why it has been selected for high starch? Because we are using it heavily into the ethanol production. So I'm sometimes surprised because people, when they're going to buy corn, they say, oh, it has high protein. Well, it doesn't matter if it has high protein, because there's a negative correlation between high protein and starch. The higher the protein, the lower the starch in the corn. So if I have a corn that if I'm offered a corn that has, let's say, for example, 10% protein, and I have another corn that I'm offered that has 7% or 8% protein, I know that the one with 7% protein will be more valuable for me as a producer, or for me as a feed mill manager, because it will allow me to formulate more dense rations, more energy dense rations. And we pay for them the same way. We pay for them by ton. We should be paying by the amount of energy that we are obtaining from the corn, or the amount of starch that we are obtaining from the corn. The protein in corn is an extra, but it's not the main purpose of the corn. The main purpose of the corn is energy. So again, when you receive corn from the US that is plump, or what we call a full corn, grain that has been filled with starch during its growth, it has around 74% starch. We have determined that in analysis. Whereas in the past, we were looking at corns that had 60% starch. And still today, you are getting corns from other origins that had 60, 65. So 10 percentage points in the corn really make a huge, in the corn starch, really makes a huge difference in the quality of the grain that you're getting and in the energy cost of the compounded feed. So again, if you are thinking that, well, I save maybe 1% or 2% by using corn from a different origin, always look at what that corn is bringing. Not just look at the price per ton. Look at how much energy that corn is bringing to your operation. I don't know if I answered the question, if the person can reply, but I think that this is very important in today's world. We need to look at the quality of the corn and not just be looking at the corn from a point of view on a per ton basis.
Thank you, Alvaro. We have other two questions. Nous avons deux autres questions.
Oui.
La première, how long can the DDGS be stored without quality depreciation?
I would say, first of all, let me clarify. When you store either corn that has been ground, and in this case, distilled grains that has been ground, obviously you're exposing the interior of the grain to different problems. The first one is obviously the deterioration of the products that are inside of the distilled grains. One of the main concerns has always been, in time, the high content of fat that the distilled grains had. In the past, we were talking distilled grain with 10% fat. Today, we're talking with distilled grains that had 5-6% fat. So we have reduced that danger of oxidation of the fat, of peroxidation of oil, or rancidity of the fat. We have reduced it because we have less fat. Having said this, I would suggest that probably close between 6 months and 1 year, you're in a safe spot with distillers grains. But remember that this is highly depending on the conditions of storage. It has to be stored in a dry place. It has to be stored away from the access of vermins or any kind of insects and rodents, etc. And if at all possible, it has to be a place that's dry, a place that has airflow, and a place that is relatively dark. The more light that the product receives directly, the more oxidation there will be in the fat contained in that product. So my short question would be 6 months to 1 year.
Thank you.
My short answer, I mean, not question.
Okay. Another question. What does it mean Hunter L and its specification?
Yeah. Well, the Hunter L is a refraction method, basically, that it's very similar to what we do with the NIR, for example, that you do a refraction analysis. With the Hunter L, you send let's say some light to the sample, and it diffracts, and you have a scale that shows how much it has diffracted or how much it has separated. So what it means is that if the 50 is the level that we consider ideal because it resembles the original light diffraction, if you will, from the corn grain. If we have values under 50, it means that it has been subjected to some damage because it's turning a little darker. So it has been subjected, it could have been subjected to some heat damage in the drying process. Whenever we have values above 50, and let me tell you, it's not very easy to obtain values above 50 because when you dry the product, even if you do it on the best of conditions, you will have a little bit of damage because any product that is subjected to temperature will receive some treatment, if you will, that results in an increase in the content, obviously, of ruminant degradable protein. The problem is when it's too much. So it is very important that you have distillers grains that are right at 50 or above. If it's 50 or below, it means that the product is darker than it should be. So ideally, that's the first figure you need to look, honestly. That's the first figure you need to look in the distillers grain when you're importing. What is the Hunter value? Am I at 50? Am I above? Or am I below 50? 50 and above is what you need to be at. Then you can go to the ProFat, and because let's put it this way. If I get a ProFat of 36, that's great. I know you've got 30% protein, 6% fat, great product. But if that product has a Hunter value of 45, then part of that protein, even if it's 30%, could be damaged, and maybe just 25% is utilized. So all your calculations based on the cost of nutrients and the cost of protein is just meaningless because you didn't consider what happened with the Hunter value. I don't know if I answered the question to its full satisfaction.
Thank you. Another question coming from the same person.
Yes.
And in case of using the DDGS, and we know that there is a decrease of milk fat, what's your suggestion to correct that?
I've always been a fan of looking at management before really attributing everything to the nutrition. This is something that usually happens. The first one to blame will be the nutritionist. But you need to take a look at what's happening with the diet of the cows, what's happening with the groups of the cows. Are the cows sorting feed? Are they separating feed? Those are all aspects that will modify the butterfat. There's research that has been done from this perspective by Cornell, and changes in butterfat, for example, have been seen when animals are not grouped in the same and are not grouped adequately, and when there is competition for feed, for example, from the more dominant cows competing for feed with the more submissive cows. With distillers grains today, the thing is that most people balance a diet on paper. And that's what I like to see. There are three rations usually. That's what I say usually. There's the ration that you formulate on paper. There's the ration that your feed manager mixes. And there's the ration that finally the cow eats. Those are the three rations. So you don't need to think that because your NDF or your fibers are good on paper, they are good on the feed bunk for the cow. I mean, your NDF could be perfect. Let's say that your NDF and your ADF are perfect. But if the particle size is wrong, if you don't pay attention to what the cows are really eating, then you have a problem with your butter fat. So again, don't stay with just the ration formulated on paper. Always, if you have a problem, go to the farm and take a look at what they're really eating and take a look at how it's mixed and what the final product looks like.
Okay, thank you, Alvaro. Another question. How about feeding DDGS in a bank for cattle?
In a
bank.
In a bank, B-U-N-K.
Yeah.
For cattle. Okay. Yes, that was our research with heifers, the one I showed right there that had the grown heifers. Actually, it was a slide that has the title with it. We fed distilled grains in a bunk for cattle, and it really worked very well. The only thing that you have to do is, for it to work even better, is to feed the exact amount that the animals will be eating. So it's kind of a limit feeding, because the problem, if not, they will be sorting, and most of the animals will be eating the distillers grain. They like it so much that they will sort and they will eat the distillers grains and leave a lot of the fiber aside. It works better if you can feed more than once a day. If you feed in the bunker once a day, the total amount that they will eat during the day, what will happen is that they will end up sorting and they will end up eating a lot of the distillers grains and then eat some of the fiber. So you might have heavy animals. It doesn't matter if it's for feedlot cattle, but it will matter if you're talking about growing heifers that you want to slow their growth and their weight gains. So the best thing that you can do is, depending on the feasibility of your farm, is to feed it in several feeds on the day, at least 2-3 times a day, or if not, move it. I mean, walk through the bank with a rake or something and move it so that you can some sort of remix what they have been sorting. It allows less sorting if you're using dry distillers grains. If you add some water to the mix, then it reduces the sorting. So if you are using straw, for example, or any kind of fibrous residues, if you add water to the mix and bring it up to, I would say, a 30% moisture, even 40% moisture, then you have better results with distillers grains in that ration.
Okay, thank you. What kind of DDGS is proposed for the dairy milk cows?
You don't have many options, because basically what you will be receiving in Tunisia is the distillers grains that it's for export, which is the one we are using here in the US. Now, for example, this is a very good question, because some of the dairies that I have been visiting with, they live close to the ethanol plants and they buy the wet distillers grains, and it's an excellent product. So the great advantage is that it's really very palatable. The animals love it, and they just bring it nearly every day, so they don't even have to think about storing it. But the product that you will be receiving in Tunisia, it's perfect, because you're talking about a product that has 30% crude protein, between 27 and 30, and high energy content. A product that, because it's declared to have a 50 points or above hunter value, so it's very light colored. So you won't have a problem of having to choose between different distillers grains. It will be high quality distillers grains, and they will give you, you will be very satisfied with the results. I can tell you that.
Okay. It looks like it's the last question. Does DDGS have another use than feed?
Where is this question coming from? From what angle? Is that yours or is?
No, it's not mine.
Other uses beside feed? No, yeah. Most of the uses right now is for feed. And this is something tricky. There's people testing distillers grains for use as human food. I mean, the SDSU, for example, has been doing trials with making cookies out of distillers grains, and you can imagine a product of this. From my own experience and perspective, I think that it will end up as a food for human use in the future. Right now, it's not authorized because of all the changes you have to make to a plant in order to make it food grade. It has to be all stainless steel. It has to be approved by the FDA, et cetera, et cetera. But in the future, I mean, you're talking, I've been to Africa, for example, you know that corn is a very, very interesting food and a very, very good staple for a lot of regions in Africa. I think this is a product derived straight from corn, just without the fat. I mean, those cookies, I took some of them to one of the meetings. I think that Reese, yeah, you're nodding, you ate a few, and I ate several. So I really like them. And I think that in the future, we might compete with the cows. So we might end up having an excellent product for regions that have problems with protein and trying balancing their diet that way. I mean, it would be an excellent product to balance with rice diet, for example, or other grains that don't have high protein content. We're talking a product with 30% protein. Meat has 21% protein. So you can imagine that.
Another question. You have a lot of questions, Alvaro, today.
Absolutely. Go ahead. I love that.
Weather affects the intake in Tunisia. We have an average of 35 degrees Celsius by summer. Is it recommended to use the DDGS?
Yes. The great advantage is you can concentrate the diets without adding too much starch to the diet. So the problem when you have heat stress, and you know, the person that asked the question knows this, is that the intake of the animal is reduced. So that's the only way they can stop the heat, the internal heat production or the heat increment, because they are eating too much fiber. So the thing is that in the cows under heat stress, one of the main concerns usually is the possibility of having acidosis, because the cows select feed that has lower particle size. They select a lot of concentrate during heat spells. So what happens with distillers grains, even the animal is selecting more particles of distillers grains, it doesn't have starch. So that's the beauty, because if it doesn't have starch, it will not create the problems of acidosis, either subclinical or clinical, that are very common in the southern US, for example, under heat stress conditions, in Florida, in Arizona. That's a very useful component of the ration, because it really concentrates the diet, adds energy to the diet without creating the problem of the excessive starch that will lead to acidosis when you have hot or really warm weather. Besides, the palatability of the distillers grains is excellent, so the cattle will really love it. You will have no problems. And let me qualify this. You know that cattle, every time you add him something new, they will suspect. And it seems that they think that we want to kill them every time that we add something new to the diet. But when you add distillers grains, they pretty soon, I would say within a couple of days, they know that this is a good thing. And you will be amazed at how they are looking for you and for the product, and how they will try to sort and eat the product compared to other feeds.
Okay, so another question. How to use the DDGS for feeding cows? I mean,
young calves.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
For fat
Well, just remember, I showed that trial that we did with 28% inclusion and 56% inclusion. I think that I feel more comfortable with around 20% inclusion. It will depend on how much are you paying for amino acids, because the problem with calves is that lysine is critical. So you have to be adding something else to the diet that will provide enough lysine for the calves to grow properly. Remember, distilled grains has as a limitation, the same limitation that corn has, lysine concentration. So, and there are several products that could be bought in the market that will supply lysine. And alfalfa, for example, is a very good source of lysine, but you don't want to include a lot of fiber in the diet of the young calf. Remember what we were saying in that slide, that recent research shows that a lot of NDF or a lot of fiber reduces the development of the rumen papillae. So what you don't want is to provide a lot of fiber. So again, having said this, balance your diets for the higher crude protein. In the past, we were talking about 18% protein for the calves. Now we're working with 20 to 22% crude protein in the starter for the like dairy calves. That is a high protein concentration if you're going to use just soybean meal. So if you are going to do a competitive ration with 20-22% protein, you better use your maximum inclusion possible distilled grains. And again, I would suggest 20% to be the optimum for young growing calves. Even having up to 20-25%, you should be in a safe spot.
Can we use the DDGS in aquaculture or in pet food?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot of research being done with using distilled grains, both in salmonids like trout, like salmon, but also in tilapia. And tilapia, it works very well with tilapia. I mean, the concentrations are very similar to what we have been discussing, around 20% of the diet. Again, remember that this is protein. There's very little starch. So there will be no fermentation, if you will, from the point of view of starch in the digestive system of the fish. So yes, it is being used, and it was very, very successfully with fish meal. Remember that, and you probably know this, that recent research has shown that taurine is critical for the growth of fish, and taurine is not available in distilled grains. So taurine is, as you know, was classified in the old times as amino acid. Is a different product biologically, but it is critical, and it's only present in feeds of animal origin. So if you're going to be using distilled grains, you need to have also feeds from animal origin. Could be fish meal, could be meat and bone meal, could be feather meal, but any of the feeds, or poultry byproduct meal, any of those feeds together with the distilled grains will make for an excellent feed in aquaculture.
Okay, thank you, Alvaro. So last question. What is the status of ethanol plants that had to close during the COVID-19 episode? And how do you see the future of this company if the oil price stay low?
Well, this is an excellent question. The problem is that right now in the U.S., you're submitting about 40% of the corn production for ethanol production. So the problem is more of a social problem, if you will. What would happen in the event that we do not include more ethanol in the gasoline? It's more of a political issue. It's not just an economic issue. If you decide the corn prices are very low in the market in the U.S. right now. So if you would decide politically to not include gasoline not include ethanol in gasoline, it will be a disaster because you will be throwing into the market 40% more corn, and the prices of corn will drop like there's no tomorrow. So basically, I think that it might not be at certain point in times because of the low gasoline prices, it might not be as convenient. We will produce a little less probably, but we will not get away with it. There's no way we can get out of it unless we find an alternative for that corn. So what I would say is just be comfortable that this will continue to be a product that it's available. And basically, we might reduce some. What happens to the plants was part of the question. Some of these plants are on standby. Some of these plants are waiting for the right moment to continue their production. And roughly, we have continue to have around 220, 215. It varies depending on the scenario, but these plants have the flexibility of the possibility of shutting down production and waiting until the right moment. But remember that this is it's not only the distillers grains and not only the ethanol. Right now, all the beverage industry, think Coca-Cola, think Pepsi-Cola, they rely on the ethanol plants to supply the CO2, the carbon dioxide for their beverages. So this is not just impacting distillers grains or impacting, let's say, ethanol. It's impacting the huge whole other industry that if we had a problem, that would be a huge problem for any administration, for any government in the US.
Okay, thank you, Alvaro. Merci pour vos questions et je vous invite à envoyer vos réponses par email. Finally, I'm taking this opportunity to thank you, Alvaro, and Finally, I'm taking this opportunity to thank both the speaker, Alvaro and Rhys, for the success of this webinar. Je vous remercie pour votre participation active à cette conférence virtuelle et j'espère vous voir prochainement dans les programmes de l'US Grain Council. Inch'Allah. Merci. Prenez soin de vous et de vos familles.